Good morning, good morning, good morning. We are ready to begin our book talk for today, day 11. And I'm going to take some time to invite some people to join me this morning. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for joining me. If you are able to see and hear me clearly, please put a thumbs up. Hope everybody is having a great morning. I am trying to invite some people in. All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning. We are on day 11 of our current book talk. And we are talking from the book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. Tim Wise is one of the most prominent, Okay. All right, we're continuing our broadcast for YouTube. So YouTube family, please forgive me as our live stream on Facebook has cut off and we're trying to figure out what is going on. All right, so let us try another device. Try another device. All right, and let's see if we can restart it. Okay. All right, let's try this again. Let's try this again. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It is day 11 of our book talk, Reflections on Race. And let's hope that our system here does not cut off on us. As we are inviting people to join us and join in on the conversation. All right. So we're trying another device right now. And so hopefully people will be able to get our notifications and join us in our talk this morning. All right. Okay. So, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise is the book. Tim Wise is one of the most prominent anti-racist activists in the United States. He is the author of 5 books and a frequent media commentator on racial issues. Tim Wise still lives in the Nashville area. We are picking up on day 11, and we are right as Tim Wise has just discussed in his youth and in his young life, how his father's near suicide had affected his life. And so we are jumping in right there. as he transitions out of senior high school and into college, into higher learning. And he's going to share some insights about his college life, and he's going to share some insights about getting into college and getting into school. So I don't believe our reading is going to be very long today. So let's just jump right in. For most of my senior year, I was able to breathe far more easily than I could remember ever having done. My dad had left that summer after the suicide attempt, and although he and my mom remained married, the separation gave me a respite from the insanity that had been my home environment for the previous 17 years. We had a successful year in debate, which was a good thing, since the debate was likely to be my key to getting into a good college. My standardized test scores were awful, barely cracking 1,000 on the old 1,600-point SAT, and my grades were a rather mediocre 3.3 on a 4-point scale. So I knew I'd probably need to wrangle a debate scholarship somewhere. Initially, I had wanted to go to Emory in Atlanta. They had a great debate team, and Atlanta, though away from home, was still close enough to get back easily for visits. But as the year progressed, it became apparent that Emory wasn't going to be an option. Over the summer, I had fallen in love, or so I thought, with a debater from Lafayette, Louisiana. I'd met her at the American University debate camp, and she was going to be attending Louisiana State University. When she told me in no uncertain terms that I simply had to go to Tulane in New Orleans, my emotions quickly trumped whatever previous plans I may have had. If I went to Emory, Monica explained, we would never get to see each other. It would be tough enough, she insisted, with her in Baton Rouge and me 75 minutes down the road in New Orleans, but at least it would be workable. So I filled out my application to Tulane, a school about which I had never even thought once, and kept my fingers crossed. My academic and romantic future hinging on the decision to be made by their admissions officers. I wasn't confident about getting in. Aside from my mediocre academics, Tulane didn't have a real debate team at that time, let alone debate scholarships to give out. So my accomplishments in the activity weren't as likely to matter as they would have at Emory. Fortunately, it must have been a down year for applicants, and so Tulane said yes. There was only one problem remaining, namely how to pay for it. Although its cost is far greater today, as with all colleges, in 1986, with tuition at $12,950 and costs combined about $20,000, Tulane was far pricier than anything my folks could afford. Complicating things further, I am notorious for procrastination, and so I had screwed around and not gotten my financial aid forms in on time. And since being late with financial aid forms means that one won't get as much assistance as might otherwise have been offered, how does one get to go to a place like Tulane? It helps, and this is surely an understatement of some significance, when one's mother is able to go down to the bank and take out a loan for $10,000 to fill the gap between what the school was offering in assistance and the overall cost for my freshman year. But how does one's mother get such a loan? Especially when, as was true for mine, she had never owned a piece of property. When you've been living paycheck to paycheck, driving cars until they stopped running, taking few, if any, vacations because you just couldn't afford them, it helps again with the understatement if one's mother's mother can co-sign for the loan. While banks don't typically lend money to folks without collateral, like my mom, they were very willing to lend the same money to someone with it, like my grandmother, who was able to use her house as a guarantee against the loan. The house in which she lived until her death in December 2009, in which my mother still resides, was the fourth home she and my grandfather had owned. Although they had been of middle-class income, my grandfather, having been in the military and then civil service for his entire adult life, they nonetheless were able to afford several nice homes in good neighborhoods, all of which had been entirely white, and as with the apartment complex where I'd grown up, not by accident. Although the Supreme Court in 1948 had outlawed restrictive covenants barring blacks from these neighborhoods, it had remained legal to discriminate in other ways until the late 60s. Even then, there was little real enforcement of the Fair Housing Act until teeth were added to the law in 1988. And even now, studies suggest there are at least 2 million cases of race-based housing discrimination against people of color every year. So in a very real sense, my grandmother's house, without which I would not have gone to Tulane or to any selective and thus expensive college, was there to be used as collateral because we were white. Not only did we have a house to use for this purpose, but it was a house in a desirable neighborhood, which would continue to appreciate each year. In other words, we'd likely make good on the loan, but if we defaulted, so what? The bank would have a nice piece of property worth more than the money they were giving my mom. They couldn't lose, and neither could I. Whiteness, institutionalized and intergenerational, had opened the door for me. After nearly 18 years of dysfunction and chaos, I was ready and willing to walk through it. My mother, however, was not nearly as ready for me to do so. Like many parents who have kids about to go off to school, she began sliding into a deep depression. For her, the notion of an empty nest was no small concern. Now that my father was also gone, she would truly be on her own. One day in the summer of 1986, while I was preparing for my move to New Orleans, Albert called and suggested we go to the Nashville Peace Fair, an annual festival with music, crafts, and dozens of information booths set up by various nonprofit organizations from throughout the region. Given my increasing politicization, I was excited to go, and Al clearly needed the progressive inoculation that the Peace Fair would provide. After all, he was about to head off to the University of Mississippi, where he'd be unlikely to see so much as a Democrat in 4 years, at least among white folks, let alone anyone truly to the left of the political spectrum. Upon returning to the apartment in late afternoon, I found my mother drinking. Actually, I found her completely in the can, and this was alarming because although my mother occasionally drank too much, it was rare for her to get started in the daytime. Even though I wanted to tell her about the Peace Fair, once I realized she was in no condition to talk, I decided to wait. It just didn't seem like the right time. Unfortunately, my mother felt otherwise. Not only did she want to discuss the Peace Fair and politics more broadly, she was itching to pick a fight, which is something she had never done before. It started slowly with her asking me about the event, and though I tried to brush it off, she seemed genuinely interested. I began to tell her about some of the information I had picked up about U.S. foreign policy in Central America, and about apartheid in South Africa, and how American corporations were helping to prop up the racist regime there. I am not exactly sure how the discussion descended into the mess it would become. The whole episode was so bizarre. I think I was too shocked to take it all in. What I recall is that at some point we got on the subject of welfare and welfare recipients. Now I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to try to invite some more friends into our broadcast because I realize that Facebook is not showing my broadcast while I'm broadcasting. In another world, in the real world, in my world, we call that censorship. So let's see if I can get these, get Facebook to actually broadcast my video live. And when one speaks of welfare in this country, whether or not one wishes to acknowledge it, one is almost always speaking of Black people, not because Black people are the only folks receiving state aid, Indeed, more whites receive benefits from the myriad social programs than do blacks, but because that is the image we have encouraged to have when we hear the term. It's an image that has become implanted in the minds of Americans, especially whites, to such an extent that it's almost automatic, and it allows politicians to criticize welfare and its recipients without mentioning race, knowing that their constituents will get the message. However, we managed to get on the subject. It was obvious that my mom, angry at me for preparing to leave her nest, was going to use this issue, the one she knew would injure me because anti-racism had been such an undercurrent in our home, as a way to lash out. The next thing I knew, she was spewing one after another nonsensical statement about lazy black women and their illegitimate children, and then launching into some extemporaneous diatribe about a particular black woman with whom she had worked. At least I thought she'd gotten along pretty well. Who in today's white Zinfandel-induced haze had become incompetent, pushy, and a bigot. In other words, we had gone from talking about a peace fair to talking about welfare to talking about a colleague of hers in a matter of minutes. And now things were getting heated, and I was firing back, which is exactly what she wanted. I was watching her use racism in a way that would have sickened her while she was sober, but now it was a tool to express some totally unrelated anger as a way to work out the existential crisis she was experiencing at the moment. It was ugly and not really understanding what was going on. In fact, at one point, I contemplated that my mother was either having a total nervous breakdown or had been a fraud all her life when it came to race. I lit into her and told her never to speak that way again in front of me. It was finally at the point where she began to utter the word that was the only word I knew growing up never to say, that I exploded, not allowing her to finish it. Bleep, bleep, in, she started. Shut the F up, I screamed. And that's when she swung at me, for the first time in my life, but slowly, not as though she really wanted to hit me. Her right arm came up in a sad and pitiful arc toward my cheek, palm open, her face contorted in pain, a pain deeper than I had ever seen there, even as she stood over my father's hospital bed on the night of his suicide attempt. This was not resignation I was seeing. She was imploding, and in the process burning away all illusions. She was going to make me hurt, not physically, as she surely knew I would stop her arm long before her hand could make contact with the side of my head, but she was making me question who she was and who I was. And for that experience, I thank her, because without it, I may have never really seen how distorted white people could be as a result of racism. My mom, after all, had been my model when it came to things political. She had been consistent, she had been clear, and she had never given me any reason to doubt her. But that confidence, that faith in her perfection was unhealthy. It was downright dangerous, because that is not the real world. That world of bedrock principle and never wavering resistance in the face of social conditioning is not the world in which real people reside. Racism, even if it is not your own, but merely circulates in the air, changes you. It allows you to think and feel things that make you less than you were meant to be. My mother, by proving her own weakness and exhibiting her own conditioning, taught me that one can never be too careful, can never enjoy the luxury of being too smug, of believing oneself so together, so liberal, so down for the cause of liberation, that it becomes impossible to be sucked in, to be transformed. We may only do it once or perhaps twice, but it can happen. So long as that is true, we mustn't romanticize our resistance, but fight to maintain its presence in our lives, knowing that it could easily vanish in a moment of weakness, anger, insecurity, or fear. Those moments are the ones that matter, after all. People never hurt others in moments of strength and bravery, or when we're feeling good about ourselves. If we spent all of our time in places such as that, then fighting for social justice would be redundant. We would simply have social justice and be done with it. And we could all go swimming or dancing or whatever people do. But it is because we spend so much of our time in that other place, a place of diminished capacity and wavering commitment, that we have to be careful. And it is for that reason that we need these reminders, however ugly, of our frailty, knowing the horrors of which we're capable is the only thing that might keep us mindful of what and who we prefer to be. So one of the things that Tim points out in this section is he's pointing out the fact that his mother kind of pulls away the illusion that she's always going to be this person who thinks perfectly about race or thinks perfectly about people of color. And he was saying that he needed to see that in order to understand that he has to remain vigilant, and he cannot romanticize his fight for justice, because at any time he can relapse based on anger or insecurity or fear. So this is part 1 for today. I'm going to come back on in just a few minutes, and I'm going to see if this video plays live and enables me to invite my followers in, because right now I'm looking on my other device and I don't see this live video, which means people don't know that I'm live right now, so they can't come in. So we're going to pause for Facebook Live, of course, which seems to have a little bit more censorship going on than my YouTube channel, which has been going nonstop. So I'll be back with part 2. All right. Got a few more pages to read for today. Let's see. Yep. Okay. All right. So let's try this now. All right. See what we can get going here. This is part 2. This is part 2 of our reading today. Our reading today. This is part 2. This is part 2. This is part 2. All right. So we're back for part 2. I'd like to thank my YouTube audience for being patient as we continue our reading today. This is part 2 of today's reading from White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. And we're going into Tim Wise's first experiences in New Orleans and his new collegiate adventures. I arrived in New Orleans with my parents and Monica in late August, though it felt more like early hell. The mercury permanently stuck somewhere between 95 degrees and heat stroke. Worse still, the humidity was congealing into solid form, enveloping me like a tight-fitting coat of phlegm, and causing me to wonder whether this girl standing next to me on Bourbon Street, for whom I made the decision to come to Tulane, was really worth it. I was starting to have my doubts, allowing my mind to wander to thoughts of college up north where it would be cooler. I'd be alone, but at least I wouldn't be covered in sweat. As we walked along the heavily trafficked tourist corridor, part of the roughly 8 square block area, that had been the core of the city at its founding in 1718 by Bienville, the French governor of Louisiana, I had to admit that having never experienced anything like it, from the smell of booze and seafood to the strip clubs to the architecture, it was certainly unlike my hometown, a city also known for music and entertainment, but of a decidedly different kind. Lower Broadway in Nashville was certainly seedy at the time, but the French Quarter, even at its seediest, had style, culture, and above all else, history. Though I didn't know yet the racialized component of that history, I would learn soon enough. In fact, I would begin learning a little something about it that very day. "Hey, mister," a young squeaky voice cried out from behind me and to the right. I spun around, not sure that the words had been meant for me after all. I hardly thought of myself as a mister, being only 17. And I saw a black kid, perhaps 10, hopping off his bike and coming towards me. "Yeah? What's up?" "I bet your dollar I can tell you where you got them shoes," the child answered. "I'll take that bet," I replied, confident that there was no way this child in front of me could really know where I purchased my footwear. Little did I know it at the time, I had, after all, been in the city for all of 2 hours, but I had just walked into the biggest trap in the history of traps. Being a big, bad Tulane student, however, I was cocky enough to assume that I had just won $1 off some kid in the quarter, not thinking for even a second that no one would have offered this bet if he didn't already know that he had me from the get-go. As it turns out, of course, and as I would soon learn, the young man had never actually claimed to know the point of origin of the shoes on my feet. He had merely offered to tell me where I got them, as in had them, at that particular moment, owing nothing whatsoever to the location of the store in which they'd been purchased, the name of which meant no more to him than my own, neither of which he had any real desire to learn. This was business, after all, not personal. He asked me to show him the money, which I did, at which point he sprang the trap. "You got your shoes on your feet, and you got your feet on the street on Bourbon Street. Now give me $1." It was a logic with once I learned the hyperliteral meaning of his initial challenge. I could hardly argue. I was indeed on Bourbon Street, between St. Peter and Iberville to be exact, my shoes planted firmly on my feet on the steaming, summer-scorched asphalt, melting in the sun. I gave him the money gladly, in the process learned more than the value of $1 alone. Transaction completed, the wordsmith and street hustler, whose linguistic machinations had probably worked on 100 tourists before, not to mention more than a few Tulane students and their parents, headed down the street in search of the next mark. It was a search that couldn't have taken long, filled as the streets of the quarter typically are. Taking money off persons such as this was quite literally what the metaphor writer must have had in mind when he first came up with the phrase, "like candy from a baby." There's something to be said, I thought to myself, about any place where poor folks, rather than just stealing your money or simply begging for it, instead earn it by way of winning a voluntary game of wits, outsmarting those who are typically far more educated and no doubt more socially respected than they. Street hustling of this sort, the kind that makes a riddle into a commercial transaction, is uniquely American in that regard. Evidence of the ability of those who have been long neglected by the political and economic system to once and again turn the tables on those for whom the rules of the game were set up in the first place. Of course, it's all made the more sweet by the realization that the kids who pull these scams know full well that the only person anyone falls for it, and most everyone does at least once, precisely because they are black and poor, and therefore presumed to lack brain power, to pull one over on those who are more white or fluent, imbued with, at least in their own minds, superior intellect. Yet they do, over and again, demonstrating the limitations of scholarly competence, which ultimately shrivels up like a dead leaf in the face of a far deeper intellect, possessed by children who are seen as uneducable by the larger society, which tells us little about those so doubted, but quite a bit about the society that doubts them. And we are going to stop there for the day. I hope that you are getting something out of these readings today. I do apologize that Facebook is censoring my videos. So if you are receiving the invites for my videos, I would encourage you to make sure that you check in and that you get on live, because if not, then Facebook will pull my videos out of the live feed on my own page, and you won't be able to see the videos live until after I record them. Also, I will continue to broadcast live stream on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, and I thank those who have been subscribing to that channel. In the future, it'll probably look like I will be doing YouTube live stream mainly, so you definitely want to subscribe there, which is Church Love 333, and we do have a live chat room there as well, so you can continue the conversation with me. I hope that you're having a great and wonderful day, a great and wonderful Friday, and I hope that I have said something today in the reading that gives you just a little bit of a glimpse into New Orleans street life. And as Tim Wise comes to find out, that just because a person's circumstances may be dire, you know, that he noticed that these kids were able to make a hustle. We call it having some street smarts, right? Being able to make a dollar and earn a dollar honestly, using your intellect without having to steal or to beg. And so this concludes our reading for the week. I will be back on Monday, and I'll be testing out my Facebook Live this weekend. So we will see how this goes, and hope to see you back on Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is our reading for the day. Take care, and God bless. All right. Thank you again for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed today's reading, and I'm sorry about the technical difficulties that we have had with Facebook Live. They do give you the opportunity to broadcast live, but there is lots of censorship happening, unfortunately. The freedom of speech and freedom of press is being suppressed now that we've unfortunately given over some of our rights to outside entities. So again, thank you for viewing this broadcast, Reflections on Race, Day 11. Thank you for reflecting with us. Take care and God bless.